Today we're going to visit a very special bomb testing site where experimental buildings were erected to protect German civilians from the increasing bombing raids. This is an experiment in a design that may have found its way into post-World War II world. These were absolutely top secret and all papers were destroyed. So to understand the concepts, we need to first look at the nature of the destruction, the threat, and those people seeking the solutions. And one very interesting player emerges on the scene, seen to be saving the lives of German civilians. During the Second World War, the deliberate bombing of civilian targets and cities had begun early on by all sides of the conflict. And of course we know of the terrible bombing raids over Hamburg, of course Dresden, and the Blitz over London. On Berlin, the RAF dropped over 45,000 tons of bombs on the city, the Americans over 22,000 tons. And initially, both German and British air forces all had a policy of only bombing military targets, at least of each other. However, after the German bombing of Rotterdam in 1940, the raid that the Germans had failed to be able to call back and stop, the British cancelled their policy on military targets only, and the first bombing raid on Berlin was on August 25, 1940. After a series of British bombing raids on Berlin, Hitler finally ordered the Luftwaffe to retaliate against London. And thus, after a series of tragic decisions, millions of people would now die and become homeless. During the summer especially, the German cities were now bombed and firebombed nearly daily, and thousands of civilian lives were lost. Something clearly had to be done, especially during the time it would take for the Luftwaffe to come up with effective countermeasures. Now the organization Tod began to construct bomb shelters in German and Austrian cities, construction projects that would gain speed as the air war intensified. It is interesting to note that one of the first Germans to speak out about the need for bomb shelters and the need to protect the civilian population and workers as well was actually Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels. Standing at his house at Lanke outside Berlin, he would see the first fires as the first bombs were unleashed over Berlin. However, as opposed to many others, the propaganda minister did not hide or shrink from the burned-out cities and towns. He actually got in his car and drove towards them. He had, since the war, been portrayed as the fanatic, calling for total war, and indeed he was one of the most dedicated supporters of Hitler and National Socialism, as well as the deportation of German Jews. However, despite his earlier disputes with Hitler in the mid-1920s, he rose to become one of the most powerful men in Germany, and as Gauleiter of Berlin and the father of modern propaganda. Hitler knew he owed much of his election success to Goebbels. He had planned Hitler's campaigns in detail. He was fiercely loyal, and when things looked bad, Hitler could always count on him for a media campaign to restore morale amongst the German population. The two men had a lifelong symbiotic yet conflicted relationships, one in which Goebbels' personal relationships and affairs often brought them to long periods of not speaking. Yet despite this, he had an enormous power. Their relationship we will explore in later episodes. However, Goebbels was always a foresighted man, and early on in the war, he was the first to warn that something had to be done to protect the civilian population. He was also one of the first to warn already in the late summer that the German army would not have enough winter clothing to fight a winter war as they approached Moscow. He began to call for donations of winter clothing, way before the army had even reached the outskirts of the town or the winter set in. This much to the chagrin of the generals who dismissed him bluntly. However, in the end, he was proven correct. He was undoubtedly an extremely intelligent and driven man, and throughout the war he wrote a diary in which he wrote of his constant ins and outs of favor with Hitler, the grief that caused him, including lamenting over Speer, Bormann, and Rosenberg. Thus, Hitler was not always apt to the advice Goebbels tried to present him. So he began to take matters in his own hand, issuing streams of directives to his fellow Gauleiters, to begin building water traps, bunkers, shelters, the breaking down of walls between connecting tunnels under buildings so people could flee firestorms safely. He would himself visit the bombed-out cities, rally the population, and he would remain in Berlin during some of the bombing raids in order to personally take charge of rescue and recovery operations. He fired several Gauleiters who he believed had not done enough, and demanded the utmost of others. Now one may look at his public appearances and rallies as a political move, as if he prepared for a coming election campaign for leadership himself, and this at a time where Hitler was seen less and less in public. Although he did not seem to be ever the man to topple or challenge Hitler again for position of leadership, but one cannot help to wonder if he had somewhat of an ulterior plan for the future. He was immensely popular, far more seen than any other leader of the Nazi Party at the time, but it did see from his diaries that his concerns for the civilian safety was genuine. However, the construction of enough shelters for civilian population faced some logistical problems, especially in the larger cities. Space for shelters, or the digging of underground shelters, was in some places a problem to find amidst the densely packed cities. And something else that had not escaped the propaganda minister's attention was that thousands of people who had not directly died from bomb hits, but from the collapsing buildings, or lack of oxygen from firestorms, or sucked directly into them. Now it is clear that at some point in 1943-44, tests had been done on the strengthening of civilian buildings or the partially reinforcement of parts of existing ones or new buildings. Obviously, basements and cellars were safer and could be reinforced to some degree, and were done so throughout the Reich. But when one looks at any multi-story building, as comprised of most housing in most German cities, from an architectural point of view, the staircase was a natural point of strength, given the need for holding both loads of people and the buildings resting upon them. And this became the thesis of a very interesting test during the war. In one of the Luftwaffe proving grounds, some 100 kilometers north of Berlin, near Rachlin Airfield, which was at the time one of the largest proving grounds of the war, some very interesting, one-of-a-kind building was constructed, along with several concrete walls, for the purpose of determining how these might stand up to aerial bombing.
Do we have any idea what they dropped on them? Any test results? Anything?
And here's where we find the remains of these tests, and the protected parts are still standing. At the time, there was no forest here. When 4 large reinforced stairwells was constructed, with a simulated apartment building in between them. These were all clad in white stones, thus they were called the White Houses. The idea was to insert these with armored doors in existing buildings and, of course, for new constructions. Thus, during air raids, the civilians could flee into the stairwells, close the steel doors, and unless the building received a direct hit, would remain safe. It was a fairly safe and easy way of making parts of buildings bomb-proof.
So the actual building fell down and the staircases remain. This doesn't have all the metal outside as the one over here, sticking out. It'll be interesting if we can find out where the measuring devices were placed inside the buildings. Because the measuring devices must have been inside the staircases. Testkörper. Test bodies. The crash test dummies of buildings. that makes perfect sense, actually. I mean, if there was test results here, they would have ended up in Berlin, so the Russians would have taken them if they weren't destroyed. That sounded interesting. You know, you sound like you're expending physical activity. It almost sounds like working out.
I just blow out the mosquitoes.
Yes, please blow out the mosquitoes. I don't even care how you blow out the mosquitoes, just do it.
Now it's for end.
Do you need light? This is really interesting to see. They built the 3 stair towers, or stairs towers. Then they built a mock building in between. They clad it all with bricks like you would any regular building to see how it would all respond to bombing nearby. This was to measure how the buildings would absorb a blast. So of course you had to be realistic with the bricks outside to try to figure out they had to build shelters that would withstand close by bombing, or they could just build reinforced staircases that would, where the population could gather in case of bombings. They wouldn't have to go to their own, and some of these, their own shelter, and some of these buildings were actually built, as far as I remember. And still stands in Berlin. Most people that might not know that they have a bomb-proof or resistant stairwell. Oh, yes.
Yes, nice and easy.
So that's the basement, I guess.
And someone seems to be down there.
There's an entrance.
No. It seems there's no entrance down there.
I think we're standing, if the whole building came down with all the bricks, then that would have made a pile that would cover up the entrance. The building next to us looks pretty good too.
Maybe there's an entrance here.
Yeah, I think maybe there's an entrance, but it's covered up by the building that fell down. Yeah. I mean, at least a basement of some sort. I mean, it looks pretty good.
See the wood lining on the surface. It's very well preserved.
It is very well. It's whole. Yeah.
Like new.
There must have been a lot of test equipment in here, but I don't see any mounts for it on any of the walls.
But you're right, there should be an entrance underneath us. But you know what? If I look at this, there's an entrance here, but it's been bricked up. I think maybe that happened after the war or something. Because it looks like maybe the same thing on this side.
And it is impressive how well preserved this cement is. Some 78, 79 years old, having been blown up several times at least. It looks like this was poured a week ago.
Hang on, I'm coming. But yeah, there's a lot of, well, I'm not going to help. There's at least a lot of rebar everywhere. But they built some of these buildings, didn't they? Some of the Berlin houses has these reinforced basements.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there's a few of them still around.
But when this is the main hall to the staircase and the flats, then this is too small.
Yeah, but look at this here. They bricked it up. There was the entrance.
But why? Makes no sense.
I don't know, to keep people like us out. That's usually why people do anything. Walking over the roof of the collapsed building. Here to the next one. So they bricked up the basements, the entrance to the basements of all of these. They actually built an apartment complex here. This is what they did. They built the full apartment building. That's fallen down later. It will be interesting to know more. I wonder if the whole building blew up and fell down from the testing, or from later.
I think later. Maybe they tested some internal combustion tests. So without any damage to the other buildings.
But that was the whole point, wasn't it? To test so people could hide in the basement wells. While the building may have been destroyed, but they were safe in here.
Yeah.
Of course, if you had enough of a blast wave to destroy the building, sitting in the funnel in here may not have been the best place either. I'm just saying.
Maybe all the flats around the core or the front, windows as well.
Jeez.
So they all sitting here.
Yeah.
Eat, sleep.
It almost must have been part of the detonation. We're standing 3-4 meters up on piles of rubble and brick, which used to be 4, maybe 5 stories of this entire building that just pancaked, and it must have been a catastrophic collapse, not a gradual one that we would have seen with nature.
It really is not just a flimsy building. And here are all the bricks that has come down on a mountain of rubble from the sides. The bricks, at least if nothing else, must have come down from the tests. And here's some much larger pieces. Okay. This building over here looks different.
And that's another interesting aspect of this. There's 4 test towers, but they all look a little different. And also the buildings that was constructed in between looks like it was constructed in different manners. Some have more bricks, some have more steel slabs. I see more rebar in some parts than others. So it looks like they were utilizing these buildings to suspend not only different type towers, but also different type of constructions of buildings.
Feeling you get from walking around on 80-year-old heavy rebar and steel that has fallen is that you get the feeling it's not going to fall any further.
I would think for anybody in construction or architecture it would be really interesting to obtain what we can of the original drawings or construction plans of these, because these buildings are so well preserved, they're so stable despite everything they've put through and being as old as they are. And clearly they were put together relatively quickly with whatever materials could be obtained, such as one of the slabs simply comprises of various bricks thrown together and in a cement form with the concrete and very little rebar. Some of them were bricks, some of them had more rebar than others, but this is still what would have been a very cheap and easy way to build a test building, and since it still stands, it might be a very inexpensive way to build a reliable building that's viable today.
Layers like a bunker, but there's no entrance. This is... I wonder how far down this actually sits. These must have been blown up. I'd like to know who blew them up. If this was after the war, this was DDR, and of course in the Russian zone. Stop doing that. So the question is, who blew this up? It was a test building for civilian construction. So would the army have taken the time to blow it up? I don't think so. Get to the next one. Let's try to get into the other ones. I'd like to see where the test equipment was placed, which I would imagine they would have equipment on all floors measuring the various vibrations, but it's hard to tell. I'm looking on the inside of the walls for any markings, electrical attachments, anything from when the building was still vertical. I might get an idea of the foundation down here.
And honestly, even the insides of the blown up building, the walls look like they were made a few weeks ago. It is totally straight. You still see the indents of bricks and mortar. They really did build this quality, even if they were planning to blow it up.
thinking this must have been a back building, some sort of a porch or a shelter, because none of this was attached up here. And again, it's interesting they closed these off. Yeah, you don't want people to get hurt, but I've seen worse. Oh, it's a rebar sticking out here. And yeah, post-war, all these will cover up really, really well. The bricks. Still see the bricks just clinging on out there over my head. Alright, this seems like a smart thing to do. Sad I couldn't get in, but I do hear dogs barking. These little details are really interesting in the construction. This could have been a roof. This could have been facing downwards. Or the foundation of the brick. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Very, very curious. Yeah, you can't get into the other buildings.
And if you look closer at the doors, it seems that the steel doors were also in place for the testing, so it was 100% realistic to what the end product would have been. And a few hundred meters from the test buildings stands some test walls that looks more like artillery targets. These test walls were used for some direct fire, not for penetration, but in order to see the spalling effect on the opposing inside wall. Interesting enough, this idea was not new. It had been thought out by the Kluge brothers in 1933. And the interesting part is that some buildings were built in such a way, such as apparently one building in Ringstrasse in Berlin, where most people living there probably does not know that they live in a partial bomb shelter. Of course, all the notes and details of these tests have since disappeared or been destroyed, but it is clear that the buildings between the stairwells have collapsed from bomb testing, but the 4 stair towers remain quite intact and seemingly undamaged between the rubble, and this was, of course, the plan. It has been claimed that they were tested by both aerial bombs or bombs placed for testing and detonated remotely. Also, I have found notes that the test wall was fired on by aircraft, not a cannon from the ground, but I cannot find confirmation on this.
These are not just artillery targets we're looking at. These are targets for reinforced buildings, for new building construction. This was a dedicated process that the Germans set in motion after it became clear that the bombing campaign of German cities was not going to end. And they had to try to come up with the best way, building heavy shelters into apartment buildings that would survive Allied bombing to the largest extent. This was a target that was vertical, and upon impact it fell over. So the impact is what it is literally lying on. And this would just have been the back sprawling. But you can't really tell. So maybe here, where the foundation may have been. Yeah, this is the foundation. This is the foundation. It was anchored in the ground here. And it went over when it was hit. And then there's this enormous crater we sort of stumbled into, or mound of dirt. We're not entirely sure, to be quite honest. The inside of this is not really deeper than the outside of the forest. Alte was? Is there any writings on it?
Yeah.
Whether this is a crater or a protective wall, we have no information. The drum was probably placed there at some later stage, but at least it is period. However, I would find this research extremely interesting and relevant today. I wonder if some of the research may not have made it into some of the buildings today, even if just as part of earthquake proofing. So, of course, if you think you might live in a building with a built-in bomb-safe staircase or shelter, please do test it, just maybe with a small 250 kilogram aerial bomb, and then call me and tell me so we can place these last remnants on the map. From now on, the Special Project series gets into the special V weapons, the tests, the bunkers, the use, and the suspicions.